The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the Florence Academy of Fine Arts when Professor Elena Marchetti first encountered what would change everything she thought she knew about sculpture. Standing before her was a marble figure that defied every principle of physics and craftsmanship she had studied for 30 years. The sculpture depicted a woman emerging from solid stone, but the impossible part was not the artistry. It was the chain. A delicate marble chain, each link perfectly formed and interlocking, wound around the figure's wrist and extended through what appeared to be solid marble, emerging on the other side of the base completely intact. Elena circled the piece slowly, her trained eye searching for any sign of joints, assembly marks, or hidden mechanisms. There were none. The entire sculpture appeared to have been carved from a single block of Carrara marble. Yet the chain moved freely through solid stone, as if the laws of physics had been temporarily suspended during its creation. Magnificent, isn't it? The voice belonged to Dr. James Whitmore, a visiting scholar from Oxford whose expertise lay in the intersection of art and ancient technologies. He had been studying similar pieces that had begun appearing in private collections around the world over the past decade. "It's impossible," Elena whispered, running her fingers along the smooth marble surface. "The chain passes completely through solid stone. Even with modern power tools, this would be incredibly difficult to achieve. With traditional methods, it should be impossible." James nodded gravely. "That's exactly why I'm here. This piece is one of 7 that have surfaced in the last 5 years, all bearing the same signature. A small symbol carved into the base that matches no known artist or workshop. Each piece demonstrates the same impossible characteristic, elements that appear to pass through solid stone without any visible joint or seam." Elena knelt to examine the base more closely. There, barely visible unless one knew where to look, was indeed a small symbol, an intricate geometric pattern that seemed to shift and change as she viewed it from different angles. It was unlike any mason's mark or artist's signature she had ever encountered. "Have you been able to trace the origins of any of these pieces?" she asked, her scientific curiosity now fully engaged. "That's where the mystery deepens," James replied, pulling out a thick folder of photographs and documents. "Each piece has appeared through different channels, auction houses, estate sales, private dealers, but when we trace them back, they all seem to have emerged from the same general region of the Italian Alps, specifically around the ancient town of Sasso Marconi." Elena knew the area well. It was a region rich in marble quarries and had been home to stonemasons for over 1,000 years. But it was also a place steeped in legend and folklore, where stories of impossible craftsmen and magical stoneworkers have been passed down through generations. "I've arranged for us to visit the area," James continued. "There's an old quarry master there, Giuseppe Benedetti, who claims to know something about these pieces. He's been reluctant to speak with outsiders, but he's agreed to meet with us." 3 days later, Elena found herself driving through the winding mountain roads towards Sasso Marconi. The landscape was breathtaking. Ancient stone villages perched on hillsides, their buildings seemingly carved from the very mountains themselves. This had been the heart of Italian stoneworking for centuries, where techniques had been passed down from father to son in an unbroken chain stretching back to Roman times. Giuseppe Benedetti was waiting for them at the entrance to an abandoned quarry on the outskirts of town. He was a man in his 70s, his hands bearing the scars and calluses of a lifetime working with stone. His eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent decades solving problems that others deemed impossible. "You want to know about the impossible sculptures," he said without preamble, his English heavily accented but clear. "You want to know how someone can make marble chains that pass through solid stone?" Elena nodded. "We're hoping you can shed some light on the techniques involved." Giuseppe smiled, an expression that held both sadness and pride. "Come, let me show you something that has been hidden for nearly 800 years." He led them deep into the quarry, past the areas where marble had been actively extracted, to a section that appeared to have been abandoned for centuries. Here, carved directly into the living rock, was a workshop unlike anything Elena had ever seen. The walls were covered with detailed diagrams and mathematical formulas, some carved in Latin, others in what appeared to be Arabic or Hebrew script. This was the workshop of Master Albertus, Giuseppe explained, lighting several oil lamps that had been placed strategically around the space. He was a student of both Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus, and he came here in the 13th century seeking to understand the deepest secrets of matter itself. As the light illuminated the workshop, Elena gasped. The walls were covered not just with text and diagrams, but with actual demonstration pieces, small sculptures that displayed the same impossible characteristics as the modern pieces they had been studying. Chains passed through solid stone. Rings were linked through materials that showed no signs of joining, and geometric shapes interpenetrated in ways that seemed to violate the basic properties of matter. But how? Elena whispered, examining a small marble cube that somehow contained a perfectly carved sphere inside it, with no visible opening or seam. Giuseppe moved to a particular section of the wall where a detailed diagram was carved. Master Albertus discovered something that modern science is only beginning to understand. He learned that matter, at its deepest level, is not solid at all. He found a way to work with stone at the moment when it exists between states, between liquid and solid, between one form and another. James had been photographing the diagrams frantically. Are you saying he discovered some kind of molecular manipulation technique in the 13th century? I'm saying he discovered that the boundary between possible and impossible is not fixed, Giuseppe replied. He learned to work with marble at the moment of its crystallization, to guide its formation in ways that seemed to defy the normal rules of physics. Elena studied the diagrams more closely. They appear to describe a process involving both chemical treatment and precise timing. The marble was not carved in the traditional sense. Instead, it was somehow guided through a controlled crystallization process that allowed for the creation of interlocking and interpenetrating elements. The process requires perfect conditions, Giuseppe continued. The right temperature, the right humidity, the right mineral composition in the stone. But most importantly, it requires understanding. Understanding of the stone's nature at the molecular level, understanding of timing, understanding of the forces that govern the transition between liquid and solid states. He led them to another section of the workshop where several unfinished pieces lay scattered on stone benches. These demonstrated the process in various stages. Elena could see how liquid marble had been encouraged to flow around forms and, through openings, then guided to crystallize in impossible configurations. Master Albertus spent decades perfecting this technique, Giuseppe explained. He created perhaps 24 finished pieces during his lifetime. But the knowledge was considered dangerous. It challenged the established understanding of the natural world. After his death, the workshop was sealed and hidden. But someone has rediscovered the technique, James pointed out. The modern pieces we've been studying, they demonstrate the same characteristics. Giuseppe nodded gravely. My grandfather was the last keeper of this secret. He taught it to my father, who taught it to me. For generations, we have protected this knowledge, using it sparingly, creating perhaps one piece every decade to ensure the technique was not lost entirely. Elena felt a chill of understanding. You're the artist behind the impossible sculptures. I'm the current guardian of Master Albertus's legacy, Giuseppe corrected. But I am old, and I have no children to carry on the tradition. The knowledge dies with me unless I find someone worthy to receive it. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself drawn back to the hidden workshop again and again. Giuseppe proved to be a patient teacher, explaining not just the technical aspects of the impossible sculpture technique, but the philosophy behind it. The process required a fundamental shift in how one thought about matter and form. The marble was prepared through a complex series of treatments involving specific minerals dissolved in precisely heated water. The stone was brought to a state where its crystalline structure was temporarily disrupted, allowing it to flow like thick liquid while retaining many of the properties of solid stone. The secret is in the timing, Giuseppe explained as he demonstrated the technique on a small piece of marble. You must work while the stone is in transition. Too early, and it behaves like liquid. You cannot achieve fine detail. Too late, and it hardens into its final form. You cannot create the impossible interpenetrations. Elena watched in fascination as Giuseppe carefully guided the semi-liquid marble around a metal form, creating a chain link that passed completely through what appeared to be solid stone. The process required incredible skill and timing. The window of opportunity lasted only minutes, and any mistake meant starting over with a new piece of marble. "Why keep this secret?" she asked as they worked late into the evening. "This technique could revolutionize our understanding of material science." Giuseppe paused in his work, his hands still covered in the strange, semi-liquid marble. Master Albertus asked himself the same question. He wrote extensively about the ethical implications of his discovery. In the wrong hands, this knowledge could be used for deception. Imagine documents or artifacts that could be created to appear ancient when they are not. Or consider the military applications, weapons or fortifications with properties that seem impossible. Elena began to understand the weight of responsibility that came with this knowledge. The technique was not just about creating beautiful sculpture. It was about manipulating the fundamental properties of matter in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. As her training progressed, Elena learned that the process was incredibly demanding physically and mentally. Working with the semi-liquid marble required constant attention. The slightest distraction could ruin hours of careful preparation. The chemical treatments left her hands raw and sensitive, and the precise timing required split-second decisions that tested her years of experience with traditional sculpture techniques. But gradually, she began to achieve results that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. Her first successful piece was a simple marble ring that passed through a solid cube, a basic demonstration of the technique that nonetheless filled her with a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced in her career. "You have the sensitivity for this work," Giuseppe observed, examining her piece carefully. "Not everyone can develop the necessary feel for the stone in its transition state. It requires a kind of intuition that cannot be taught, only awakened." As Elena's skills developed, Giuseppe began sharing more of the historical context of Master Albertus's work. The 13th century scholar had been part of a broader movement to understand the natural world through direct experimentation and observation. His sculpture technique had emerged from his studies of crystallization and mineral formation, but it had been only one part of a larger body of knowledge that challenged the conventional understanding of matter and energy. He wrote that he had discovered the language of stone, a way of communicating with matter at its most fundamental level, Giuseppe explained. The impossible sculptures were just the visible manifestation of this deeper understanding. Elena began to see connections between Master Albertus's work and modern quantum physics, the idea that matter exists in multiple states simultaneously until observed, the understanding that the boundaries between solid and liquid are not as fixed as they appear. The medieval scholar had somehow intuited principles that modern science was only beginning to formalize. But there were also disturbing elements to the historical record. Master Albertus had written about other applications of his discoveries, ways of working with metal and glass that produced similar impossible effects, techniques for creating structures that appeared to violate basic engineering principles. Some of these writings have been deliberately destroyed or hidden, deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. "Power corrupts," Giuseppe said simply, "and the power to manipulate matter at the molecular level is considerable." Master Albertus realized this near the end of his life. He chose to limit the transmission of his knowledge to ensure it would be used responsibly. Elena found herself grappling with the same ethical questions that had troubled the medieval scholar. As her skills improved and she began creating more complex, impossible sculptures, she realized she was walking a fine line between art and something that could be considered a form of advanced technology. The implications extended beyond sculpture. If the principles behind the technique could be fully understood and systematized, they might lead to new forms of construction, new materials, new ways of shaping the physical world. But they might also lead to new forms of deception and manipulation. One evening, as Elena worked on her most ambitious piece yet, a marble sculpture depicting intertwined figures with chains that passed impossibly through their joined hands, Giuseppe made an unexpected announcement. "I have decided to document the complete technique," he said quietly. "For 800 years, this knowledge has been preserved through direct transmission from master to student. But the world is changing too rapidly. If something happens to both of us, the knowledge could be lost forever." Elena looked up from her work, sensing the weight of his decision. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means creating a complete record. Not just the techniques, but the philosophy, the ethics, the warnings that Master Albertus embedded in his teachings. It means choosing carefully who will have access to this information in the future." Over the following months, Elena found herself serving not just as a student of the impossible sculpture technique, but as a collaborator in creating what amounted to a comprehensive manual of a lost art. Giuseppe had her document every aspect of the process: the chemical preparation of the marble, the precise timing required for each stage of the work, the tools and techniques needed to achieve specific effects. But, more importantly, she found herself helping to articulate the ethical framework that should govern the use of this knowledge. They worked together to identify potential safeguards and limitations that might prevent the technique from being misused. Knowledge itself is neutral, Giuseppe reflected as they worked late one evening. But the application of knowledge reveals the character of those who possess it. Master Albertus understood this. He embedded tests and challenges in his teaching method that would reveal the character of any potential student. Elena began to understand that her training had involved such tests from the beginning. The patience required to master the technique, the humility needed to work with materials that demanded respect rather than domination, the wisdom to recognize when knowledge should and should not be applied. These were not incidental to the sculpture process, but central to it. As word of her work began to spread discreetly through academic circles, Elena found herself contacted by collectors, museums, and researchers who wanted to commission impossible sculptures or gain access to the technique. Each request forced her to make difficult decisions about how and when to apply her knowledge. She developed a careful screening process, turning down requests that seemed motivated primarily by commercial gain or curiosity, accepting only commissions that served legitimate artistic or educational purposes. Each piece she created was accompanied by detailed documentation of its creation process, ensuring that future scholars would understand what they were looking at. The work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. Elena discovered that creating impossible sculptures required her to push the boundaries of not just her technical skills, but her understanding of art itself. Working with marble in its transition state was like collaborating with the stone. She had to learn to guide rather than force, to suggest rather than demand. One of her most significant pieces was a sculpture commissioned by the Vatican Museums, a representation of St. Thomas examining the wounds of Christ, with marble fabric that appeared to flow through the saint's outstretched hands. The piece took her nearly 6 months to complete, working in carefully planned stages that allowed the marble to crystallize in impossible configurations. The reaction to the piece was extraordinary. Viewers found themselves questioning not just how it had been created, but what it meant to see matter behaving in ways that seemed to transcend normal physical laws. The sculpture became a focal point for discussions about the relationship between art, science, and faith, exactly the kind of dialogue that Elena had hoped her work might inspire. But success brought new challenges. As her reputation grew, she found herself under increasing pressure to reveal her techniques or to create pieces for clients whose motivation she questioned. The art world, she discovered, was not always prepared to handle knowledge that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible. Giuseppe, now in his 80s, began to show signs of failing health. The physical demands of working with a marble in its transition state were taking their toll, and he spoke increasingly often of the need to ensure the continuity of Master Albertus's legacy. "I've been thinking about the future of this knowledge," he told Elena one afternoon as they worked together in the ancient workshop. "The world is changing rapidly, and new technologies are emerging that might make our techniques seem less miraculous. But there are deeper principles here that will remain relevant regardless of technological advancement." Elena nodded, understanding that he was preparing her for greater responsibility. "What do you think Master Albertus would want us to do?" Giuseppe smiled, his weathered hands still moving skillfully as he guided the semi-liquid marble around a complex form. "He would want us to ensure that this knowledge serves beauty and truth, not deception or domination. He would want us to train others who share these values, and to guard against those who do not." As Elena's mastery of the technique reached new levels, she began experimenting with applications beyond traditional sculpture. Working with Giuseppe, she developed methods for creating impossible architectural elements. Stone arches that seemed to support themselves without adequate foundations, decorative elements that interpenetrated in ways that defied structural logic. These experiments led to collaborations with forward-thinking architects who were interested in pushing the boundaries of what was possible in stone construction. Elena found herself working on restoration projects for ancient buildings, using her techniques to recreate damaged elements that could not be reproduced through conventional methods. The work was historically significant, but also personally demanding. Each project required her to balance the authentic preservation of historical architecture with the responsible application of knowledge that could easily be misused for fraudulent purposes. One of the most challenging projects was a collaboration with archaeologists working to restore a damaged medieval cathedral. Bombing during World War II had destroyed several carved stone elements that were crucial to the building's structural integrity. Traditional restoration methods could not recreate the precise interlocking stonework that the original builders had achieved. Using her impossible sculpture techniques, Elena was able to create replacement elements that matched the original work not just in appearance, but in structural function. The restored cathedral stood as a testament to the potential of her knowledge to serve historical preservation and cultural continuity. But the project also raised difficult questions about authenticity and historical accuracy. The restored elements were created using techniques that the original builders had not possessed, or had they? Elena began to suspect that Master Albertus's knowledge might have been more widespread in medieval times than previously assumed. Research into historical records revealed hints that similar techniques might have been known to certain medieval craftsmen. References to stone that flowed like water and chains carved from single blocks appeared in various historical documents, suggesting that the impossible sculpture technique might have been part of a broader body of knowledge that had been gradually lost over the centuries. This possibility added new dimensions to Elena's work. If the techniques had indeed been known to historical craftsmen, then her restorations might be more historically authentic than anyone had initially realized. But it also meant that the knowledge carried even greater responsibility. She might be recovering lost wisdom that had been deliberately suppressed or forgotten. Giuseppe's health continued to decline, but his commitment to documenting and preserving the knowledge remained strong. Together, Elena and Giuseppe created what amounted to a complete encyclopedia of the impossible sculpture technique, including not just the practical methods, but the historical context and ethical framework that gave the knowledge meaning. Master Albertus wrote that knowledge belongs not to individuals, but to humanity, Giuseppe reflected as they worked on the final sections of their documentation. But he also wrote that humanity must be ready to receive certain forms of knowledge responsibly. Our task is to ensure that this balance is maintained. Elena began to understand that her role was evolving from student to guardian. She was not just learning the technique. She was inheriting responsibility for its preservation and appropriate application. This meant not only continuing to create impossible sculptures, but also identifying and training the next generation of practitioners. The selection process proved to be as complex as Giuseppe had suggested. Elena found that technical skill alone was not sufficient. The impossible sculpture technique required a particular combination of artistic sensitivity, scientific curiosity, and ethical maturity that was rare among potential students. She developed a teaching method based on Giuseppe's approach, but adapted for contemporary students. The process began not with technical instruction, but with philosophical exploration. Students had to demonstrate understanding of the ethical implications of the knowledge before they were allowed to begin practical training. The first student Elena accepted was Maria Santos, a young sculptor from Brazil who had shown extraordinary sensitivity in her traditional stone carving work. Maria proved to have an intuitive understanding of the marble's behavior in its transition state. But more importantly, she demonstrated the kind of philosophical maturity that the work demanded. Teaching someone else makes you realize how complex this knowledge really is. Elena reflected to Giuseppe as they watched Maria work on her first successful impossible sculpture. It's not just about technique, it's about developing a completely different relationship with matter and form. Giuseppe nodded, clearly pleased to see the knowledge being successfully transmitted to a new generation. Master Albertus wrote that each student must find their own path to understanding. The techniques provide the foundation, but the true artistry comes from within. As Elena's work gained recognition in academic and artistic circles, she found herself invited to speak at conferences and symposiums around the world. These speaking engagements provided opportunities to educate broader audiences about the historical significance of impossible sculpture techniques, while maintaining appropriate discretion about the specific methods involved. The challenge was always to share enough information to contribute to scholarly understanding while protecting knowledge that could be misused. Elena developed a careful balance, focusing on the philosophical and historical aspects of the work while keeping the technical details restricted to serious practitioners. One particularly significant presentation was at an international conference on medieval technology and art. Elena's paper on Master Albertus's work provided new insights into medieval understanding of material science and challenged conventional assumptions about the technological capabilities of 13th century craftsmen. The response from the academic community was intense interest mixed with healthy skepticism. While Elena's documentation was thorough and her reasoning sound, the implications of her findings were so significant that they required careful verification and peer review. This process of academic validation proved to be as challenging as mastering the sculpture technique itself. Elena found herself navigating complex questions about evidence, authenticity, and the standards of proof required for extraordinary claims. The scientific community's skepticism was understandable, but sometimes frustrating for someone who had directly experienced the reality of the impossible sculpture process. Giuseppe's death came peacefully in his sleep during the winter of Elena's 5th year of training. He had lived to see the documentation of Master Albertus's knowledge completed and the first new students successfully trained. His final words to Elena had been simple. Remember that this knowledge is a gift to be shared responsibly, not a secret to be hoarded selfishly. Elena felt the full weight of her inherited responsibility as she conducted Giuseppe's funeral according to ancient local traditions. The ceremony included elements that dated back centuries, connecting her directly to the long line of craftsmen and guardians who had preserved this knowledge through generations of political upheaval and social change. Standing in the ancient cemetery overlooking the marble quarries where Master Albertus had first discovered his techniques, Elena made a commitment to honor both the letter and spirit of the knowledge she had inherited. She would continue to create impossible sculptures, train worthy students, and protect the techniques from misuse, but she would also work to gradually integrate this knowledge into the broader understanding of art and science. The work continued, but with new challenges and opportunities. Elena established a formal research institute dedicated to the study of historical materials science and advanced sculpture techniques. The institute provided a legitimate academic framework for investigating and preserving knowledge like Master Albertus's discoveries while maintaining appropriate controls on sensitive information. Research conducted at the institute began to reveal connections between the impossible sculpture techniques and other historical mysteries. Evidence emerged suggesting that similar principles might have been applied to metalwork, glassmaking, and even architectural construction in various historical periods. Elena found herself at the center of a new field of study that bridged art history, materials science, and archaeology. One of the most significant discoveries was a series of architectural elements in a monastery in Tibet that displayed characteristics similar to impossible sculptures. Working with international colleagues, Elena was able to demonstrate that these elements had been created using principles identical to those discovered by Master Albertus, suggesting that this knowledge had been independently developed in multiple cultures. This finding supported the growing understanding that the impossible sculpture technique represented not an isolated medieval discovery, but a rediscovery of principles that might have been known to various ancient civilizations. Elena's work began to contribute to a broader reevaluation of historical technological capabilities and the transmission of knowledge across cultures and centuries. The Institute attracted students and researchers from around the world, creating a community of scholars dedicated to understanding and preserving advanced historical techniques. Elena found herself not just practicing the impossible sculpture method, but leading a broader movement to recover and responsibly apply lost knowledge from various historical periods. As her own mastery of the technique reached its peak, Elena began pushing the boundaries of what was possible even within the impossible. Her most ambitious project was a large-scale architectural installation for a new museum of science and technology in Geneva. The piece incorporated elements that seemed to float in space, supported by connections that passed through solid stone in defiance of normal structural logic. The installation required 2 years of careful planning and execution, with each element created separately and assembled according to precise calculations that took into account the unique properties of marble in its transition state. The result was a work of art that also served as a functional architectural element, demonstrating the potential of impossible sculpture techniques to contribute to contemporary construction methods. The public response to the installation was overwhelming. Visitors found themselves confronting their assumptions about the nature of matter and the possibilities of human craftsmanship. The piece sparked discussions about the relationship between art and science, between ancient wisdom and modern technology, between the possible and the impossible. But the installation also attracted the attention of individuals and organizations whose interests Elena found troubling. Requests for information about the techniques came from military contractors, commercial manufacturers, and private collectors whose motivations seemed to prioritize profit or power over artistic or educational value. These encounters reminded Elena of the warnings that Master Albertus had embedded in his teachings and that Giuseppe had emphasized throughout her training. The knowledge carried with it the potential for both creation and deception, for both beauty and exploitation. Her role as guardian required constant vigilance against those who would misuse what she had learned to preserve. Elena developed increasingly sophisticated methods for screening potential students and collaborators. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished genuine interest in the artistic and philosophical aspects of the work from attempts to gain access to valuable commercial or military technologies. The screening process itself became a form of teaching, designed to reveal character and motivation through carefully structured challenges and observations. Elena found that the most suitable students were often those who approached the work with humility and patience rather than ambition and urgency. One of Elena's most successful students was David Chun, a young physicist who had become interested in the impossible sculpture technique through his research into the properties of matter at transition points. David brought a strong scientific background to the work, but also demonstrated the artistic sensitivity and ethical awareness that the knowledge demanded. Under Elena's guidance, David began exploring the connections between the impossible sculpture technique and quantum mechanical principles. His research suggested that Master Albertus had somehow intuited aspects of matter's behavior that modern physics was only beginning to understand through sophisticated mathematical models and experimental apparatus. It's as if he found a way to work directly with quantum mechanical properties using medieval tools and techniques, David explained as he presented his findings to the Research Institute. The timing and conditions required for the sculpture process seem to take advantage of specific quantum states that allow matter to exist in multiple configurations simultaneously. Elena found David's scientific perspective illuminating but also cautionary. While understanding the physics behind the technique could lead to new applications and improvements, it also raised the possibility that the knowledge could be systematized and mechanized in ways that might make it more accessible to those with questionable motivations. Master Albertus embedded safeguards in his method that go beyond simple technique, she reminded David. The personal preparation required, the sensitivity needed to work with the materials, the ethical framework that guides the application. These are not incidental to the process, but central to it. As Elena entered her second decade of working with the impossible sculpture technique, she began to see her role shifting from practitioner to philosopher. The deepest questions raised by the work were not technical, but ethical. How should knowledge that challenges fundamental assumptions about reality be shared and applied? She found herself writing extensively about these questions, contributing to academic journals, and speaking at conferences that addressed the broader implications of advanced historical techniques. Her work began to influence discussions about the responsibility of researchers and artists when dealing with potentially disruptive knowledge. One of Elena's most influential papers examined the parallels between contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and biotechnology and the choices faced by historical figures like Master Albertus when they discovered knowledge that could be either beneficial or dangerous, depending on how it was applied. Every generation faces the challenge of managing knowledge that has the potential to transform society, she wrote. The wisdom of previous generations, embedded in traditions like those preserved by Giuseppe's family, offers valuable guidance for navigating these challenges responsibly. Elena's work with impossible sculptures had become just one aspect of a broader investigation into the nature of knowledge, creativity, and responsibility. She found herself at the intersection of multiple disciplines, contributing to conversations about art, science, history, philosophy, and ethics. The Research Institute had grown into an internationally recognized center for the study of advanced historical techniques and their contemporary applications. Students and researchers came from around the world to participate in programs that combined practical training with philosophical exploration and ethical reflection. But success brought new challenges. As the Institute's reputation grew, so did pressure from commercial and governmental interests seeking access to the knowledge and techniques being preserved and developed. Elena found herself spending increasing amounts of time on administrative and political tasks, protecting the Institute's independence and mission from those who would exploit it for narrow purposes. The challenge of maintaining balance between openness and discretion, between sharing knowledge and protecting it from misuse, became a constant preoccupation. Elena developed policies and procedures designed to ensure that the Institute's work would serve the broadest possible human interests while preventing the exploitation of sensitive knowledge. One of the most difficult decisions Elena faced was whether to document the impossible sculpture technique in sufficient detail to allow its reconstruction by future generations, even if the direct transmission of knowledge were interrupted. The historical precedent was clear. Master Albertus's knowledge had nearly been lost entirely, preserved only through the dedication of Giuseppe's family. After extensive consultation with colleagues, students, and ethical advisors, Elena decided to create a comprehensive archive that would be distributed among multiple institutions and sealed for a specified period. The archive would include not just technical documentation, but also the historical context, ethical framework, and cautionary guidance that gave the knowledge its full meaning. We cannot control how future generations will use this knowledge, Elena reflected as she worked on the final sections of the archive. But we can ensure that they will have access to the wisdom and warnings of previous generations when they make their own choices about its application. The completion of the archive marked a milestone in Elena's career, but not an ending. At 65, she remained active in both creating impossible sculptures and training new practitioners. Her most recent work included a series of pieces designed specifically for educational purposes, sculptures that demonstrated the technique's principles in ways that could inform and inspire without revealing sensitive details. These educational pieces were distributed to museums and universities around the world, sparking interest in the broader questions that the impossible sculpture technique raised about the nature of matter, the history of technology, and the responsibility that comes with advanced knowledge. Elena's legacy was already evident in the work of her students and colleagues. The Research Institute had become a model for responsible investigation and preservation of advanced historical techniques. The impossible sculpture method was being applied to projects ranging from architectural restoration to contemporary art installations, always within the ethical framework that Master Albertus had established and that Giuseppe had preserved. Standing once again in the ancient workshop where her journey had begun, Elena reflected on the path that had brought her from a conventional professor of sculpture to a guardian of impossible knowledge. The work had challenged everything she thought she knew about art, science, and the nature of reality itself. But perhaps the most important lesson had been about the nature of responsibility itself. Knowledge, Elena had learned, was not a possession to be owned, but a trust to be stewarded. The impossible sculptures were beautiful and technically remarkable, but their true significance lay in what they taught about the delicate balance between discovery and wisdom, between capability and restraint. The secret of impossible sculptures was not ultimately technical, but philosophical. It lay in understanding that the most profound forms of knowledge require not just intellectual mastery, but personal transformation. Master Albertus had discovered not just how to make marble flow like water, but how to approach the natural world with the humility and respect that such power demanded. As Elena continued her work, training new students and creating new pieces that pushed the boundaries of the possible while respecting the wisdom of the past, she carried forward a tradition that connected her to craftsmen and thinkers across 8 centuries of human history. The impossible sculptures stood as monuments not just to technical achievement, but to the enduring human capacity to discover, preserve, and responsibly share the deepest secrets of the world around us. The hammer and chisel she had learned were tools for working with stone in its familiar, solid state. But the greatest sculptors throughout history had always worked with something more mysterious and more powerful. The liminal spaces between states of being, the moments of transition when the impossible briefly becomes possible, and the wisdom to recognize and preserve such moments for the benefit of all humanity. In the end, the secret of impossible sculptures was the secret of all truly transformative knowledge. It belonged not to any individual, but to the human community as a whole, held in trust by each generation for those who would come after, preserved and protected by those with the wisdom to understand both its power and its responsibility. The years that followed brought unexpected developments that would test Elena's understanding of the knowledge she had devoted her life to preserving. It began with a discovery in the basement archives of the Vatican Library, where researchers cataloging medieval manuscripts came across a collection of documents that bore the same geometric symbol Elena had first encountered on the impossible sculptures. Cardinal Alessandro Toretti, the Vatican's chief archivist, contacted Elena personally with news of the find. We have discovered what appears to be Master Albertus's complete philosophical writings, he explained during their video conference. But there are sections written in a cipher we cannot decode, and diagrams that seem to describe techniques far beyond what we thought possible for the 13th century. Elena felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. Each new discovery about Master Albertus seemed to reveal deeper layers of knowledge and responsibility. "I'd like to examine the documents personally," she replied. "There may be elements that only become clear to someone familiar with his practical techniques." 2 weeks later, Elena found herself in the climate-controlled reading room of the Vatican Secret Archives, wearing white cotton gloves as she carefully turned pages of parchment that had remained unread for centuries. The documents were even more extraordinary than Cardinal Toretti had suggested. Master Albertus had not only documented his impossible sculpture techniques, but had also recorded discoveries about working with other materials. Metals that could be shaped like clay yet retain the strength of steel, glass that could be woven like fabric, and, most remarkably, techniques for working with what he called the fifth element, a substance that seemed to exist partially outside normal matter. He writes about materials that exist in multiple states simultaneously. Elena explained to Cardinal Toretti as they reviewed her preliminary findings. The impossible sculpture technique was apparently just the beginning. He was working with the fundamental nature of reality itself. The implications were staggering. If Master Albertus had indeed discovered ways to manipulate matter at such a fundamental level, it suggested that medieval natural philosophy had reached heights of understanding that modern science was only beginning to approach through quantum mechanics and materials engineering. But as Elena delved deeper into the documents, she began to understand why Master Albertus had been so cautious about sharing his complete knowledge. The later manuscripts describe techniques that could be used not just for art and construction, but for creating materials and structures with military and economic applications that would have been devastating in the wrong hands. He writes about metals that could cut through any armor, about glass that could capture and hold light indefinitely, about stones that could amplify human voices across vast distances. Elena reported to an emergency meeting of the Research Institute's advisory board. The knowledge goes far beyond sculpture into what we might recognize today as advanced nanotechnology and quantum engineering. The discovery prompted intense debate among the Institute's members about how to proceed. Some argued for complete secrecy, believing that such knowledge was too dangerous to investigate further. Others advocated for careful research under controlled conditions, suggesting that understanding these historical discoveries might benefit contemporary science and technology. Elena found herself once again in the position of guardian, but now facing decisions that even Giuseppe had never had to confront. The documents described not just techniques, but complete theoretical frameworks that could potentially revolutionize multiple fields of knowledge. Dr. Sarah Hassan, a quantum physicist who had joined the Institute's advisory board, provided crucial perspective on the scientific implications. If these descriptions are accurate, Master Albertus somehow developed working theories about quantum entanglement, superposition, and field manipulation using medieval terminology and conceptual frameworks, she explained. The practical applications he describes would require an understanding of physics that we've only achieved in the last few decades. Elena began a careful translation and analysis of the most sensitive documents, working with a small team of trusted colleagues who had demonstrated both the expertise needed to understand the material and the ethical judgment required to handle it responsibly. The work was slow and painstaking, as much of Master Albertus's advanced theory was encoded in allegorical language designed to conceal its true meaning from casual readers. One of the most significant discoveries was a detailed description of what Master Albertus called the Great Work, a project that would integrate all of his various techniques into a single creation that would demonstrate the ultimate possibilities of matter manipulation. The description was fragmentary and heavily coded, but it appeared to outline plans for creating a structure that would exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. He's describing something that sounds like it could be a portal or gateway, Dr. Hassan observed as they worked through the mathematical sections of the text. The physics is incredibly advanced. He's working with concepts that we've only recently begun to explore theoretically. Elena felt the weight of discovery and responsibility pressing down on her like never before. The impossible sculptures had been remarkable, but ultimately limited in their implications. This new knowledge suggested possibilities that could fundamentally alter human understanding of reality and capability. As word of the Vatican discovery began to spread through carefully controlled academic channels, Elena found herself facing unprecedented interest from government agencies, private corporations, and international research organizations. The potential applications of Master Albertus's advanced techniques were too significant to ignore, but also too dangerous to pursue without extreme caution. The situation became more complex when Elena received an unexpected visitor at the Research Institute. Dr. Kenji Nakamura was a materials scientist from Tokyo who claimed to have independently developed techniques similar to those described in Master Albertus's documents. I have been working for 15 years on what I call transition state engineering, Dr. Nakamura explained as he demonstrated a small device that appeared to make metal flow like liquid while retaining its structural properties. I developed these methods through modern scientific research, but when I heard about your historical discoveries, I realized that someone had explored these principles centuries ago. Elena watched in fascination as Dr. Nakamura manipulated materials in ways that closely paralleled the impossible sculpture technique, but applied to different substances. His approach was based on contemporary quantum physics and material science, but the underlying principles were remarkably similar to those Master Albertus had discovered through medieval natural philosophy. This raises profound questions about the nature of discovery. Elena reflected as she and Dr. Nakamura compared their respective knowledge. Are we rediscovering lost wisdom, or are these insights inevitable once human understanding reaches a certain level? Dr. Nakamura's presence at the Institute created new opportunities for understanding the connections between historical and contemporary approaches to advanced materials manipulation. His modern scientific framework provided tools for analyzing Master Albertus's work in ways that had not been possible before, while the historical perspective offered insights into applications and implications that contemporary research had not considered. Working together, they began to develop what they called integrated materials philosophy, an approach that combined the practical techniques of impossible sculpture with the theoretical framework of quantum material science. The collaboration produced results that neither could have achieved alone, creating materials and structures that pushed the boundaries of what either historical or contemporary methods could accomplish individually. But the collaboration also attracted unwanted attention. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries began expressing interest in the work, recognizing its potential military and strategic applications. Elena found herself navigating increasingly complex negotiations about research funding, security classifications, and international cooperation agreements. Master Albertus faced similar pressures. Elena reminded her colleagues during one particularly tense meeting with government representatives. He chose to limit the spread of his knowledge rather than risk its misuse. We may need to make similar choices. The decision to restrict access to certain aspects of the research was not made lightly. Elena and her colleagues established a multi-layered classification system that separated basic historical research from practical technique development and theoretical advancement. Only the most trusted and ethically committed researchers were granted access to the complete body of knowledge. This approach created its own challenges, as it meant that some of the most significant discoveries in materials science and quantum physics were not being shared with the broader scientific community. Elena wrestled with the ethical implications of withholding knowledge that could benefit humanity while protecting it from those who might use it harmfully. The solution came through the development of what Elena called graduated disclosure, a system that allowed for the gradual release of information as the broader scientific and ethical frameworks needed to handle it responsibly were developed. Basic principles were shared openly. Practical techniques were taught to qualified practitioners under controlled conditions, and the most advanced applications remained restricted to a small circle of guardians. As Elena entered her 70s, she began to see the fruits of this approach in the work of a new generation of researcher practitioners who combined deep technical knowledge with strong ethical foundations. These individuals were not just learning techniques, but were developing wisdom about how to apply advanced knowledge responsibly in an increasingly complex world. One of the most promising developments was the emergence of international protocols for handling potentially transformative discoveries. Elena's work with impossible sculptures had become a model for other fields grappling with similar challenges, from artificial intelligence to biotechnology to quantum computing. We are not the first generation to face these challenges, and we will not be the last, Elena observed in a paper that became widely influential in academic and policy circles. The wisdom of previous generations, preserved in traditions like those we have inherited from Master Albertus, offers crucial guidance for navigating the ethical dimensions of advanced knowledge. The Research Institute had evolved into something unprecedented, a center that combined active research and development with historical preservation and ethical reflection. Students came not just to learn techniques, but to develop the judgment needed to apply them wisely. The curriculum included not only technical training, but also extensive study of philosophy, history, and ethics. Elena's most ambitious project in her later years was the creation of what she called the Living Archive, a comprehensive documentation of the impossible sculpture tradition that included not just written records, but also video demonstrations, interactive models, and virtual reality experiences that allowed future generations to understand the knowledge in its full context. But the Living Archive was more than just documentation. It was designed as a teaching tool that would actively guide future practitioners toward responsible application of the knowledge. The archive included built-in ethical challenges and decision-making scenarios that would test the character and judgment of anyone seeking to access its deepest levels. Knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, Elena explained to the International Commission that was considering formal recognition of the Institute's protocols. We must ensure that future generations inherit not just our discoveries, but our understanding of how to use them wisely. The Commission's endorsement of the Institute's approach marked a turning point in how the global community thought about managing transformative knowledge. Elena's work had demonstrated that it was possible to preserve and develop advanced techniques while maintaining strict ethical oversight and preventing misuse. As Elena prepared for retirement from active research, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from a conventional professor of art history to a guardian of knowledge that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The impossible sculptures had been just the beginning. The real discovery had been learning how to balance the drive for knowledge with the wisdom to use it responsibly. Her final project was a single sculpture that incorporated all of the techniques she had learned and developed over 3 decades of work. The piece depicted a tree whose marble roots extended through solid stone into hidden chambers, while its branches reached toward a sky rendered in materials that seemed to shift between states of matter. The sculpture was titled Knowledge and Wisdom, and it stood in the courtyard of the Research Institute as a reminder to all who saw it that the greatest achievements of human creativity required not just technical mastery, but also deep understanding of responsibility and restraint. The work had taken Elena 5 years to complete, as each element required perfect timing and conditions. But the result was something that transcended the merely impossible. It was a work of art that seemed to embody the very principles that Master Albertus had discovered and that Giuseppe had preserved, that matter and energy, knowledge and wisdom, possibility and responsibility were all aspects of a deeper unity that could only be approached with humility and respect. Elena's retirement ceremony was attended by students, colleagues, and dignitaries from around the world. But The moment she treasured most came when Maria Santos, her first student, presented her with a small impossible sculpture that Maria had created using techniques Elena had taught her combined with innovations of her own. "The knowledge lives on," Maria said simply, "and it will continue to grow and evolve as each generation adds their own understanding to what has been preserved." Elena smiled as she examined Maria's work, recognizing in it not just technical excellence, but the wisdom and restraint that were the true hallmarks of mastery. The tradition that had begun with Master Albertus in the 13th century and had been preserved through centuries of guardianship would continue into the future, guided by the same principles of beauty, truth, and responsibility that had sustained it through its darkest and brightest moments. The secret of impossible sculptures, Elena realized, had never been just about manipulating matter or creating beautiful objects. It had been about something more fundamental: the human capacity to discover profound truths about reality while maintaining the wisdom to use those discoveries for the benefit of all humanity. Standing in the courtyard beside her final sculpture as the sun set behind the mountains, Elena felt a deep sense of completion. The knowledge was secure, the tradition was thriving, and future generations would inherit not just the techniques of impossible sculpture, but the understanding of how to balance knowledge with wisdom, capability with restraint, and discovery with responsibility. The impossible had become possible through centuries of patient work and careful guardianship. And now it would continue to evolve, guided by the same principles that had sustained it from the beginning: that the greatest achievements of human creativity require not just technical mastery, but also deep respect for the profound responsibilities that come with transformative knowledge. In the gathering twilight, the marble tree seemed to shimmer with an inner light, its impossible structure standing as a testament to the enduring human capacity to discover, preserve, and responsibly share the deepest secrets of the world. The secret of impossible sculptures had been revealed not as a technique or a formula, but as a way of approaching the world with wonder, wisdom, and humility, qualities that would ensure its preservation and appropriate development for generations to come.